4:21 on Kent's radio station. This is BBC Radio Kent. The horror writer Stephen King, as some of you will know, is amongst my favourite novelists. Dismissed by some as a hack and a purveyor of lowbrow populist nonsense, adaptations of his films are equally as argued over in the pub about which stories make the best movies. No one-camp man has put the arguments to bed in a brand new book called Stephen King on the Big Screen. Mark Browning was born and brought up in Tunbridge, and his latest book has just been published. And just before we came on air, he told me how the book came about.
Well, I was writing a book about David Cronenberg, and I had cause again to look at The Dead Zone, great film with Christopher Walken. And it seemed to me that it was something that hadn't been done. It was almost like a pub conversation. So many films had been made from Stephen King novels, and yet why were there so many that were truly, truly awful? And some that were really good, and there didn't seem to be a reason why. And The Dead Zone is one of my favourite films, and it came from that, really, to start with.
I was going to put this fact to you, that it is like a great pub conversation between movie buffs or horror film buffs or something. But as a film lecturer yourself, you go into quite a lot of critical film theory about why films might be more successful than other films.
To a degree. The book really is aimed at... I suppose it sounds a bit of a horrible cliche, but the discerning film viewer, people who like to watch films and talk about them and argue about them. It uses some film theory, but it's not designed to send anybody to sleep too quickly. Film theory, I think, is important. It's often misunderstood. Students still study a fair bit when they do film studies degrees, but it isn't widely read. I mean, the most obvious references that I make are to genre theory, because it seems to me that a lot of Stephen King films are mismarketed quite often. Films like Carrie, Cujo, even The Shining, you could argue are not actually horror films at all. And it seemed to me that looking at it through the perspective of genre was quite an interesting idea that hadn't really been done before. There are books about Stephen King, of course, but they often get stuck on this idea of being true to the source novel. People get very worried about whether things are included or not, or whether it really is what Stephen King wanted, when quite often they just miss the point that film and literature are very different media. A page of screenplay it can only be a minute of screen time, so however big these big novels of Stephen King are, fundamentally they're going to get reduced down to 90 pages of quite widely spread text.
As a young man growing up in Tunbridge, were you either fascinated by King as an author, or were you finding yourself down at the ABC in Tunbridge Wells every single week?
It's not there anymore, is it? I don't think.
No, well, it's an empty shell just up the road from us, actually.
Right, yeah, most cinemas are, unfortunately. Well, yeah, I always loved film, but it was somewhat later that I discovered you could really study it as a legitimate way of passing your time and call it work. No, when I was working...
It's like being on the radio, Mark, in that respect.
It could be. You know far more about that than I do. No, I was working as a teacher. I'm a teacher by profession, and I was working in Plymouth and did an evening course, A-level film studies, and that was back in 91, I think. And since then I've studied film whilst working full-time as a teacher, and been an education lecturer as well, so I've followed a kind of three-track career, and gradually built up my qualifications in film until I had an MA, PhD, and then wrote things, and eventually people were interested enough to publish them.
All right, then, let's get to the nub of the matter. What conclusions, well, without giving too much away, what conclusions do you draw from the work of King?
Well, there's quite a few. I think in the conclusion I've put about 15 or so reasons why I think they don't always work. That sounds very negative, but there are lots of great things about most of the adaptations. But just to give you one example, there's a group of films based around machines, and King has a rather strange view of machines. He has said several times that he's scared of machines he doesn't understand, and I think on that basis most of us would be scared of most machines we use, since if a computer breaks or a car breaks down, we usually have to get somebody else to come and fix it for us. Yeah, he has an almost kind of Luddite feeling about machinery, cars especially. So there are a few films where cars and lorries are supposed to be the source of evil or the source of fear or threat. And it just doesn't work, because what we see on screen is a car with blacked out windows supposedly driving itself. But with a tiny little tweak, that's Herbie. Herbie Goes to Monte Carlo or something, which is not threatening at all. Most of us driving in any urban centre will be surrounded by cars, some with windows tinted, being driven aggressively by people we can't see, and we don't tend to freak out. So it's not really something that's that otherworldly. It doesn't seeing cars without human agency doesn't really seem to pose a substantial threat.
Having said that, I have to say I love Christine, the book and the movie as well, although it's not in my top 4 Stephen King adaptations. Shall I tell you those now? And we can get this pub fight thing out of the way.
Sure.
All right. Shawshank Redemption.
Number 4 or number 1?
Well, I don't know. I'm not grouping them in order. These are just the top 4 in my humble opinion. Shawshank, The Shining, Stand By Me, and Misery. What made you of that list, Mark Browning?
Well, interesting, because obviously lots of people don't associate Stand By Me with Stephen King, or same with Misery sometimes. Shawshank's very interesting, because started off slowly, almost disappeared opposite Forrest Gump when it came out, but year by year in popular polls it seems to be the film that people come back to, referred to at funerals, seen as an inspirational film. That's got a lot going for it. I think if you were looking for a possible number 1, certainly if you compare it with Maximum Overdrive, King's only experience in directing, the two seem poles apart, really. Very good central performance by Tim Robbins. Interestingly, of course, the best films often have the least input by Mr. King, which is another interesting aspect, that the more input he has, if he writes the script, if he has an executive producer role, quite often the worse the film becomes.
Yeah, it's interesting, that point, isn't it?
And so we have Maximum Overdrive, which is arguably one of the worst, or the Shining remake. If you're talking about the Kubrick film as one of your 4, it's an interesting comparison with the 1997 TV remake, which King had a big hand in, and tried to put everything back in that Kubrick took out in 1980. And although Kubrick came under a lot of criticism for missing things out and changing things, you can kind of see why when you put it all back in. So yeah, I think you've got a good list there. Misery's very interesting. Kathy Bates took a lot of the credit, won an Oscar for her performance, but Oscars often reward quite eccentric, histrionic acting, I think. And James Garner, the person she's playing opposite there, very much underrated, having to act often with facial expression alone, being tied to a bed for large parts of the film, either by drugs or literally being tied to a bed as a hostage. He has to do a lot of work without much to play with, I think, so his performance in that film is often, I think, underrated too. So I would say, those 4 are pretty much there or thereabouts. I would add Apt Pupil, which is a little known and such a terrible title, Apt Pupil. Great little film. It's a real gem. If you've not seen it, you need to check that one out.
Is that the one with the ex-Nazi war criminal?
That's the one. That's usually the killer description.
Mark Browning's brand new book is called Stephen King on the Big Screen. Look out for it in your bookshops now. Mark, great to talk to you. Thanks for being with us on Radio Kent today.
That's okay. Anytime.